Welcome back to episode 2 of season 2 of the TVAC Business Sales podcast with Damien and Sam. Last episode, we introduced you to Will and Sammy in our team, and you heard a little bit about them, and they shared some pearls of wisdom with what they do and what they've learned so far. The next few episodes, we're actually just going to talk about, I guess, experiences that Damien and I have come across over the last few years. We're going to share some war stories and share some knowledge with you. And today, we are going to talk about common myths that owners believe about selling, common myths and misconceptions. Now, Damien, you've been doing this for almost 20 years, so you've certainly come across a few myths and misconceptions.
Over 20 years now, Sam.
Oh, geez.
I know that does date me, but never mind. Look, I really want to cover 3, possibly 4 common myths that vendors may have. And, it's really important, particularly with the first one. Let's talk about multiples. And everyone loves to think they know about, what was the multiple? That business sold for 15 times, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, there's some very clear things to talk about with multiples. Firstly, what are you multiplying? What profit base are you working from? Are you working from an owner's cash surplus before they pay themselves? Are you working from an EBITDA before you've allowed for depreciation or CapEx? Are you working from EBIT? Or are you working from net profit after tax? Now, you can take the same company and those numbers will be progressively lower. So depending on which of those numbers you use will depend on where the multiple may sit. So I think the first thing we say to people who might have come in with a preconceived idea around multiples is, well, what are you multiplying? And then we just step them through that process. So that's really the key thing for us is what are you multiplying? And then what is the multiple for that industry? And we focus on market data, and I think you're going to touch on that shortly. One thing I would like to share, we've got a lot of resource and we do pay a lot of attention to the market as to what businesses are selling for. And I've taken a lot of interest, particularly in the sort of what you would call the medium enterprise space. To be fair, they're not our clients. They're larger than the clients we deal with. They're turning over 50, 60, $80 million. They're exporting to Australia or further afield. And or they might be retail, and they might be a multinational retailer. And I've looked at probably 5 or 6 different companies like this, looked at what they are selling for, because this information is publicly available if you dig deep enough. And their EBITDA multiples are in the 5 to 6.5, maybe 7 times, absolute tops. Now, when we're dealing with a business that's turning over $1 or $2 million and it's making 300 or 400K or maybe $1 million even for the owner, and they're coming in and they're wanting a 5 or 6 times multiple, it's just not going to happen. I mean, unless the business is heavily capitalized and there's a lot of stock or plant. So I think it's really important in terms of when you're looking at multiples, understand really where the market is at. And we've got all of this information. There may be rules of thumb for certain sectors. Sam, you're an accountant, or you were in a former life. And, we both know that sometimes accounting fees might sell for 60 cents or 70 cents in the dollar or 80 cents in the dollar of your turnover. Up north, they might sell for $1, 1 times turnover. That would be a rare occasion where rules of thumb, perhaps, a multiple of turnover 1 times, it might apply. Again, if you've got a small business, when I say small, up to 5 million turnover, up to $1 million profit, in New Zealand terms, that's still relatively small. Your value is not going to be any revenue multiple at all. It is highly unlikely to be. Those sort of, those sort of ratios are really, when you're talking about the Xeros of this world or small cap businesses that are being listed and go to market. So that's probably the key thing that, the messages I want to get around multiples is, A, perhaps they're not quite as high as your mate over the neighbourhood barbecue thinks they might be, and B, what actually are you multiplying? Because that makes a huge difference to the number that you want to be talking about.
And I think an issue is that we know what the market data is, and we know what multiples are attracted by which industries, etc. However, a lot of people don't, and that's why it's a common myth and misconception. And even accountants They do their best in valuations, but quite often they don't have access to what we have, which is almost 1,000 business sales over the last 20 years. I've seen in valuations by some very big and astute accounting firms, they're comparing a business that's 10 times larger than the business being valued, and our businesses sold in Australia that have been running for 20 years, and they're saying, oh, that achieved a 4 times multiple, when we're in the business they're valuing is only 2 years old, and that should only really be a 2. So it's apples and oranges, but what they don't have access to or we have access to, you can't compare a business with another business that's 10 times the size with 10 times the staff. It's got a lot less risk involved. That's why it attracts a high multiple, and it's been going for a lot longer. So the issue is, and why it is a misconception, is that sometimes your professional advisors are actually sharing that information with you, and then they come to us, don't they? You think, oh, I think I can get, a 7 times multiple because I got told that by my accountant. And we go, sorry to burst your bubble, buddy, but this is the reality. Here are 3 businesses that we've sold in the last 4 years that have attracted a 3.2 times multiple. This is the reality. If you're wanting a 6 or 7 times multiple, we can't actually help you because you're just not going to achieve it.
Yep. And I think maybe just closing out on this subtopic within this particular myth, when your business is appraised or valued by a broker or your accountant or a business advisor, it always pays to have a reasonable number of comparators. One of the things that we do find is that there might be one comparator and someone's gone through the market data on BizStats or whatever, and they've cherry-picked to suit their own purposes. And that's not appropriate. Our obligation as brokers is to ensure that the comparative data we provide is valid and reliable, and there's a range. And we then say, right, well, this business stacks up against these comparators in this way, therefore we think it's slightly a better multiple because it stacks up better, there's less risk areas, or actually there's a couple of areas of high risk, so it comes back and it's discounted. So again, anyone who's putting a value around your business shouldn't just be relying on one single multiple or even on an overall average of some numbers. It's finding that really good comparative data. Sam, the second thing that I'm going to touch on, and it's near and dear to my heart, is some vendors, and to be fair, not all, but some vendors and sometimes their advisors think brokers make easy money. The fees are bandied around. Look, our fees are higher than real estate fees. And the reason for that is that most of what we're selling is intangible assets. It's not like a house where, what you're selling is bricks and mortar. For us, it's, you've got stock, you've got plant, you've got intangible assets. And so in terms of when a broker comes up and they quote, and to be fair, the fees are relatively similar across the industry. So, no one broker stands out as being, or brokerage stands out as being more expensive or less expensive. But the key thing is, and it comes back to your comment around the data and the knowledge that we've got. Tobac's been going over 25 years, over 800 sales, and I think over $750 million worth of sales. And so, there's an enormous amount of A, information, and B, knowledge that's inherent in the team within the wider tobacco community. Now, we're South Island, and we also have access to the North Island guys. A sale process, when you're selling your business, it's quite a long continuum. Look, it could happen as quickly as in 4 weeks, which has happened with us, and it can take 18 months, which has happened with us. But your continuum, the key steps, and a broker is involved in almost all of these. Your preparation. Now, that might be done with your accountant prior to seeing a broker, or it might be done in conjunction with your broker. Then the appraisal of value, which requires a broker and comparative data. If you agree and you go to market, then all the sales documentation. Then you go to market, you're using the broker database and other forms of promotion and advertising. You've got to get the confidentiality sorted out. You've got to discuss and answer questions with interested buyers. You move into a due diligence process. And again, that it can be fraught. And you can't just go into DD and then just leave it and hope that the lawyers and the buyer and the seller and their accountants will all get on. That doesn't necessarily always happen. So the broker is actively involved at all steps of this process, then right through to confirmation. Confirmation's great because that's when the deposit is paid and the buyer is fully committed to the purchase. But even then, there's a bunch of stuff that's got to happen before settlement. And then those pre-settlement steps and variables, again, we are often called and called in to make a comment around that. If one or other of the parties, or even occasionally their advisors, makes a stance on something which is aberrant or is against the norm, we get called in to say, hey, come on, now you got to take a step back here and I'd take some further advice on this, Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Seller, because that's not quite the norm. So I guess my comment around do we earn our money, a good broker is heavily involved at all stages and really does add some value. We will be doing a specific episode on various deals that have happened and perhaps touching on where us as brokers have tried to make a difference. And at the end of the day, our view is that we do earn our money. I'll close on this with one quite interesting example. It's the only example I've ever had in 20 years of doing this, where a sale confirmed, but then the buyer couldn't settle. Well, they asked if they could be let off settling. They had some real health issues that had developed through this process, and the vendors were good people, and we all agreed that that was the most humane, for want of a better word. It was that the appropriate course of action was to actually say, okay, we're not going to hold you to this. Even though you are legally obligated. A fee was still paid, the vendors weren't out of pocket, but we'd all lost an enormous amount of time. We were just about to go back to market. The vendors said to me, look, we've actually had an approach through a wider family member. We'd like to have a crack at doing this ourselves. I was more than happy for them to do that. They'd gone through the ringer with this early process. But we're 6 months down the track. I've been following their progress through access to their Dropbox, and they're still going through the process. Now, they haven't tried to engage me, which is fine, and I'd love for this to confirm for them, and I think it will. But I think if you asked either of the husband and wife involved as the vendors, was this process worth doing yourself, they would resonate with oh my God, I never realized it was so much work. And as much as we just have to tell vendors what we will be doing, and they don't know us and they don't know the process. The reality is that by the end of it, and we've got hundreds of testimonials and some Google reviews, we're just building up that resource at the moment. Most vendors would say, you know what, you guys did a great job. And ultimately, all they're going to be paying us is probably no more than 3 months worth of profit, maybe even a bit less. And if you've owned a business for 20 years, and then you're paying someone 3 months worth of profit to get a new owner in and give yourself the rest of your life free, is that so bad?
Oh, and look, there's been business sales that I've had probably in my earlier days that have dragged on for a couple of years. And they weren't bigger businesses as I was just starting out. And potentially I could have walked away a year down the track when the business wasn't sold. The vendor could have been quite challenging to work with. But I was determined and sold the business maybe 2 years later. Earned a commission because we only get paid if we sell the business. We charge an admin fee, but it's not a big retainer like I think brokerages internationally do. We get paid if we sell the business. So if we walk away, you basically write that time off, which could be 20 hours, it could be 100 hours, it could be more. Some of these businesses that I sold in my earlier days, if I were to work back and actually look at the hours that I put into it and worked out an hourly rate, I think I did that with a couple with, I won't mention you there. Don't do that. One retailer, I think at the beginning, furniture retailer.
Oh my God.
And, yeah, I remember that one. Yes. And I sold the business, but I sort of roughly worked out how many hours, and it was way less than minimum wage I earned for that business. If I had walked away and didn't sell though, I would have earned nothing. So yes, there are some people who do look at our fees, and our bigger transactions, they are bigger fees, but gee whiz, we put some hours into those. It's not just a fly by night, here's a profit and loss to a buyer. What do you reckon? We're writing 20, 30 page IMs. We're learning more about their business than sometimes the vendor knows. And they say that to us. They go, gee whiz, you know more about the bloody thing than I do.
Or they decide they might not sell.
Yes, we do say, we do such a good job that they go, geez, I didn't know my business was so great. And then they decide to keep it, which does happen. And so then we make no money. But then we do know when the time does come, they're going to come to us.
That's right.
Most people are decent people. So we earn our fees. We work hard for our fees. Sometimes we get great, quick, simple wins. Other times we certainly don't. If it was that easy and we made millions, everybody would do it. And they don't, because sometimes I think there's only a certain kind of individual would actually do what we do. It's a very lumpy industry. We're tied to the economy as well. If the economy's cranking, then we can crank. If it's going not so good, as Damien can attest, having been a broker through the GFC, it can be very
and
challenging.
earthquakes had their moments,
Yeah.
but no, look, it is good.
Mm.
And look, just finishing on, let's talk about the third myth, and it really is quite a strong myth, is around multi-offers.
No.
A vendor loves the idea that a number of buyers are clamoring to purchase their business. And for sure, if there's a multi-offer scenario in play, then generally we're likely to get an offer close to or at asking price, or occasionally above asking price for someone who really wants to buy that business. But they are challenging insofar as we're governed by real estate law. So there is a multi-offer process that comes into play. And so there's various steps that have to be followed and forms that should be ideally completed and deadlines that need to be met. And people also change their mind. A buyer might be very keen and then they say, I'm going to put an offer in. We've got another buyer that's equally keen. So we have to advise, hey, look, someone else is going to be putting an offer in. Person B says, yeah, well, I want to put an offer in. And then we advise person A, and person A gets the pip and says, well, I'm out of here. And suddenly there's not a multi-offer, So it's a bit fraught from a broker perspective.
It's not enjoyable, is it? I tell you, the only person that likes multi-offers is the vendor. We don't like them because I always feel that the person that misses out always feels that I'm stitching them up. And we're so careful to be fully transparent. We put everything in writing so we know there's nothing that and I think in real estate sales and possibly business sales, yes, there is a little bit of tomfoolery with other brokers, slightly unethical behavior. So we're quite strict we follow a very strict process. If it's a multi-offer, it's a multi-offer. If that buyer A decides to pull out at any stage, we then have to go back to buyer B and say, it is no longer a multi-offer. It is now just you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer B. You can actually amend your offer now, or we have to be fully transparent. It's all in writing, because the last thing we want is anything. I still can't help feel that I've stitched them up. I feel bad because I've put the time in, but the reality is we have to abide by the real estate rules, and we have to do the best thing by our vendor as well.
But I think, and herein lies the difference between, if you do have a multi-offer, I've got 2 or 3 examples where I really try to make sure that I don't have a disenfranchised buyer. And I've had enough experience where the initial offer that was accepted is not the offer that's confirmed, where the initial buyer has either got cold feet, or they couldn't get funding, or, there was an issue around, family health circumstances arose, or whatever it might be. So we've got to go back, kind of cap in hand to the second person or the other offerer and say, look, the business is now available, and it's available through no reason, or no bad reason around the business itself. Would you like to continue with your interest? And fortunately, there's a number of occasions where we have been able to rekindle an offer from another party who had shown interest. So it's a part of that is also how your broker manages that situation. And you've got to have empathy. And I think the key thing is, again, it's about experience and it's about how you handle it. And so multi-offers can be a bit more challenging. You've got to manage that process pretty well. But the overriding takeout from this particular myth is generally, and probably 90% of our sales, one business has one buyer. We generally work with one buyer at a time, and they go through that purchase process. It's quite remarkable, really, how it kind of transpires. So it's not like a house where you have lots of people putting their hand up. One buyer will be absolutely captured by the opportunity, and they'll move through the process with us, and they'll complete. So, but yeah, multi-offers are not all stacked up to be if you're a vendor. But that's pretty much my 3 key ones, Sam.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. We've got a next episode. We're actually covering mistakes that vendors can make, and they kind of ties in with some of the myths because they correlate with each other. So we will explore some of these further in the next episode. But otherwise, I think we've held your attention for long enough, and we shall see you next episode.